Sheriff Mark Reynolds had been in law enforcement for over 20 years. He had seen many things, some good, some bad, but nothing ever felt routine. Tonight, as he pulled into the gas station, all he wanted was a cup of hot coffee before heading back on patrol. The town was quiet, the streets empty, and the gas station's bright lights hummed against the dark night sky. As he stepped inside, he immediately noticed a young girl, about 12 years old, standing near the cold drink section. She was small, her clothes slightly wrinkled, and her long hair looked like it hadn't been brushed in days. Something about her caught his attention. She wasn't looking at the shelves or picking a drink. She was glancing around the store, almost as if she was searching for something or someone. Behind her stood a middle-aged man, tall and thin, wearing an old jacket. His eyes were fixed on her, but he wasn't speaking. His grip on the girl's shoulder was firm, and every time she moved, he seemed to press his hand down a little harder. Sheriff Reynolds felt his instincts kick in. Something was off. Parents didn't usually hold their kids like that, not with such tension. The girl finally looked at him. Their eyes met. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, slowly, she raised her hand and made a small gesture with her fingers. It was quick, almost unnoticeable, but Mark caught it. It was a signal, a silent SOS. His heart rate sped up slightly. He had read about this, a hand signal taught to children in danger, a way to ask for help without speaking. Mark didn't react right away. If the man was dangerous, he couldn't alert him. He needed to be careful. Instead, he nodded politely, acting as if he was just another customer, and walked toward the counter. His eyes remained sharp, watching them from the corner of his vision. The girl and the man stepped forward to pay. Mark noticed her hands trembling as she tried to grab a pack of gum from the counter. Then she did something even more alarming. She tried to slip a note onto the counter. But before it landed, the man's hand snatched it away. Mark's stomach tightened. That was it. He had seen enough. Acting casual, he greeted the store clerk. "Quiet night, huh?" The clerk, a young man, nodded. "Yeah, nothing much happens around here." Mark leaned in slightly, keeping his voice calm but firm. "You seen them before?" The clerk glanced at the girl and the man, then shook his head. "Nope, never." Mark gave a small nod, then tapped his radio discreetly, sending a silent signal for backup. He turned back toward the girl and the man, now walking toward the exit. If she needed help, he wasn't going to let her walk out of that door. Not tonight. Sheriff Mark Reynolds knew something was wrong. His training had taught him how to read situations, how to spot danger even when no one was saying a word. As the girl and the man made their way toward the exit, Mark kept his eyes on them, every movement sharp in his mind. The man seemed too calm, almost too confident. He didn't act like a father, at least not in the way Mark expected. Mark had seen fathers with their children in town, and they usually acted with gentleness and care. This man, though, had a cold, controlling presence. Mark stood still, letting them pass by him. He didn't want to raise suspicion, but he had a feeling that the girl's silent SOS was just the beginning of something far more dangerous. He glanced toward the store clerk, a young man named Sam. Sam was busy wiping down the counter, but Mark could see that he was aware of the situation. His eyes flicked toward the girl and the man, and he quickly turned his head, trying not to make it obvious. Mark gave Sam a small nod, a silent request for information. Sam's eyes widened, and he quickly shook his head. "Never seen them before," he whispered, but his voice trembled slightly. Mark had learned to trust his instincts. Something about the girl's expression, her quiet plea for help, stayed with him. He looked at the man, who was now preparing to get into an old car parked just outside. The girl didn't move toward the car right away. She stood, frozen, her eyes darting from the man to Mark. In that moment, Mark realized it was now or never. He couldn't let her go, not without knowing what was going on. As the man opened the car door, Mark casually walked toward them, his boots tapping against the pavement. He wasn't rushing. He couldn't afford to alarm them, but he wasn't about to let them drive off without asking questions. "Everything okay?" Mark asked, his voice friendly but firm. The man looked at him for a moment, then shrugged, a forced smile spreading across his face. "We're fine," the man replied quickly. "Just a long drive." Mark didn't buy it. He had heard that same line before. Something about it didn't add up. The girl, standing next to the car, wouldn't look at him. Her face was pale, her hands clutching the edges of her jacket. She seemed to be holding her breath, as if she were afraid to move. "Are you sure?" Mark asked again, keeping his tone even. He had to give her a chance to speak without the man hearing her. The man tensed at the question, his eyes narrowing. But before he could say anything, Mark took a step forward, a little closer to the girl. It was a subtle move, but it was enough. The girl shifted her weight slightly, and for the first time, her eyes met Mark's again. They were full of fear, but there was something else in them now, a flicker of hope. Mark felt a surge of determination. He couldn't let this go any longer. He smiled gently at the girl, trying to make her feel safe. "Don't worry, we're just having a chat." The man's expression turned serious, but Mark ignored him. He had to focus on the girl. "Are you okay?" Mark asked her softly. Her lips quivered, and she barely nodded, but it was enough. She was asking for help, and Mark was going to give it to her. Mark's instincts had been right. This wasn't just a random stop at a gas station. It was a dangerous situation that he couldn't let slip away. He radioed for backup again, his voice calm but urgent. This was just the beginning. Sheriff Mark Reynolds took a deep breath, trying to keep his calm. He needed to act without making the situation worse. The girl's eyes told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't free. She needed help, and fast. The man was standing too close to her, his posture rigid, watching Mark closely, as though he was waiting for something. Mark could feel the tension in the air. His mind raced. He knew that making the wrong move could make the man suspicious. He didn't want to alarm him, but he had no time to waste. He had to be careful, or the girl might be taken away before he could do anything. With a casual motion, Mark reached for his radio, giving a quiet but urgent call for backup. The backup wasn't just for him. It was for the girl, too. As soon as the radio call went out, he turned back toward the man, forcing himself to keep a relaxed expression. "Long drive, huh?" Mark said, trying to sound friendly. The last thing he wanted was for the man to panic. The man gave a tight smile, his eyes cold. "Yeah, just taking her back home, you know," he replied, his voice a little too quick. Mark didn't believe it. Something about the way he said it didn't sit right. Mark took another step forward, careful not to make it seem too obvious. He looked at the girl again, offering her a smile. She didn't smile back, but her eyes softened for a moment, just enough for Mark to know that she appreciated his presence. "You know, I just realized I didn't get your names," Mark said, keeping the tone light. "I'm Sheriff Reynolds, just checking in to make sure everything's okay." The man hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable. "We're fine, really, just tired from the drive." The girl shifted on her feet, her body language telling Mark she didn't believe him. She was standing with her arms crossed tightly, almost like she was trying to protect herself. It wasn't normal behavior for a young girl to act like that around a man she called father. Mark kept his voice steady. "I understand, but I'll need to see your IDs. Just protocol." He glanced at the man, giving him a chance to respond. The man stiffened, his eyes darting toward the girl for a moment before he looked back at the sheriff. Sure, no problem," the man said, pulling out his wallet and handing over his ID. But Mark noticed the hesitation in his movements. It was like the man was trying to delay something, like he was trying to buy time. The sheriff took the ID, glanced at it, and immediately knew something was off. The name on the ID didn't match the man's face. Mark's suspicions grew. "I'll just be a moment," Mark said, turning toward his patrol car to run the man's information through the system. He didn't want to raise too much suspicion, but the clock was ticking. As he reached the car, Mark quickly glanced over his shoulder. The girl was still standing there, her body stiff, but her eyes never left him. It was as though she was silently asking him to hurry. With one hand on the door of his patrol car, Mark's thoughts raced. The girl was in danger, and he was the only one who could get her out of it. He took a deep breath, focused on the task at hand, and silently hoped he wasn't too late. Sheriff Mark Reynolds took a deep breath, trying to keep his calm. He needed to act without making the situation worse. The girl's eyes told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't free. She needed help, and fast. The man was standing too close to her, his posture rigid, watching Mark closely, as though he was waiting for something. Mark could feel the tension in the air. His mind raced. He knew that making the wrong move could make the man suspicious. He didn't want to alarm him, but he had no time to waste. He had to be careful, or the girl might be taken away before he could do anything. With a casual motion, Mark reached for his radio, giving a quiet but urgent call for backup. The backup wasn't just for him, it was for the girl too. As soon as the radio call went out, he turned back toward the man, forcing himself to keep a relaxed expression. "Long drive, huh?" Mark said, trying to sound friendly. The last thing he wanted was for the man to panic. The man gave a tight smile, his eyes cold. "Yeah, just taking her back home, you know," he replied, his voice a little too quick. Mark didn't believe it. Something about the way he said it didn't sit right. Mark took another step forward, careful not to make it seem too obvious. He looked at the girl again, offering her a smile. She didn't smile back, but her eyes softened for a moment, just enough for Mark to know that she appreciated his presence. "You know, I just realized I didn't get your names," Mark said, keeping the tone light. "I'm Sheriff Reynolds, just checking in to make sure everything's okay." The man hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable. "We're fine, really, just tired from the drive." The girl shifted on her feet, her body language telling Mark she didn't believe him. She was standing with her arms crossed tightly, almost like she was trying to protect herself. It wasn't normal behavior for a young girl to act like that around a man she called father. Mark kept his voice steady. "I understand, but I'll need to see your IDs, just protocol." He glanced at the man, giving him a chance to respond. The man stiffened, his eyes darting toward the girl for a moment before he looked back at the sheriff. Sure, no problem," the man said, pulling out his wallet and handing over his ID. But Mark noticed the hesitation in his movements. It was like the man was trying to delay something, like he was trying to buy time. The sheriff took the ID, glanced at it, and immediately knew something was off. The name on the ID didn't match the man's face. Mark's suspicions grew. "I'll just be a moment," Mark said, turning toward his patrol car to run the man's information through the system. He didn't want to raise too much suspicion, but the clock was ticking. As he reached the car, Mark quickly glanced over his shoulder. The girl was still standing there, her body stiff, but her eyes never left him. It was as though she was silently asking him to hurry. With one hand on the door of his patrol car, Mark's thoughts raced. The girl was in danger, and he was the only one who could get her out of it. He took a deep breath, focused on the task at hand, and silently hoped he wasn't too late. Sheriff Mark Reynolds felt a surge of relief when the girl spoke. "I don't know him." Her words were soft, but they rang loud and clear in his ears. She was finally telling the truth. She wasn't with the man voluntarily. She was in danger. Mark's eyes moved quickly between the girl and the man, who was now visibly tense. The man had been trying to keep control of the situation, but Mark could see it slipping away. He had to act fast before the man made a run for it or tried something else. "You need to step back, sir," Mark said firmly, his voice carrying authority. He didn't want to escalate things, but there was no room for hesitation. The man took a step back, his eyes darting nervously. He had no idea how much Mark already knew. "What's going on here?" Mark asked, keeping his voice steady. He didn't need to shout or raise his tone. He knew that calmness was the key, but the man didn't respond. Instead, his hand subtly moved toward his pocket, and Mark noticed the motion. It wasn't a simple gesture, it was defensive, like the man was reaching for something. Mark's training kicked in immediately. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to take control of the situation before the man could do anything dangerous. "I said step back, sir," Mark repeated, his tone sharp now. He moved in close enough to block the man's path and prevent him from reaching into his pocket. The man hesitated for a moment, then looked at the girl one last time, a look of frustration and fear crossing his face. Mark wasn't going to let that be the moment where everything went wrong. At that moment, backup arrived, and Mark didn't waste any time. "I need you to take him into custody." He gestured toward the man, who now seemed to realize that he had lost control. The officers who arrived were quick to act, approaching the man with careful precision. The man tried to resist, but it was no use. The officers secured him quickly, pushing his arms behind his back and placing handcuffs on him. He mumbled something under his breath, but no one was listening anymore. Mark had seen enough of these situations to know when someone was done pretending. The girl, who had been standing silently, finally let out a small breath of relief as she watched the man being taken away. She hadn't made a sound, but her body language spoke volumes. She was trembling slightly, but there was something else too, a sense of relief. The danger was finally over for her. Mark turned to her gently. "It's okay. You're safe now." He smiled, trying to reassure her, but he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She didn't speak at first, but after a long pause, she nodded slightly, her lips trembling. An officer came over to Mark, holding up a burner phone and a small bag of items they had found in the man's pockets. The items didn't make sense. Fake IDs, a map, and some strange tools Mark didn't recognize. It was enough to confirm the suspicion that this wasn't just a random incident. The man had been planning something much more dangerous. Mark nodded to the officer, acknowledging the evidence. The situation wasn't over, but the most important part was done. The girl was safe. The man was going to face justice, and Mark could finally breathe a little easier knowing that he had stopped something terrible from happening. "We'll get you back home, okay?" Mark said to the girl, who looked at him with wide, grateful eyes. He was already thinking ahead, but for now, the most important thing was getting her the help she needed. This wasn't just another night on patrol for Mark Reynolds. This was a moment he'd never forget. A moment when everything changed because of one silent plea for help. Sheriff Mark Reynolds stood by the patrol car, his eyes locked on the young girl. Now that the immediate danger had passed, he felt a rush of relief, but there was still much to be done. He needed to hear her story, understand what had happened, and make sure she was safe. The man, now handcuffed and placed in the back of a patrol car, was being driven away to the station. Mark was determined to find out everything. But the most important question was, who was this girl, and why had she been with him? He turned back to the girl, offering her a gentle smile. "You're safe now." His voice was calm, soothing. She hadn't said much so far, only nodding in response to his questions. But he could tell she was still in shock. She had been through something difficult, and Mark wanted to give her space, but he knew they needed to talk soon. "You did the right thing," Mark said, crouching down so that he was eye level with her. He didn't want to overwhelm her. "Can you tell me your name?" The girl looked down at her feet for a moment, her fingers twisting the fabric of her jacket. She took a deep breath, as if trying to gather the courage to speak. Finally, she whispered, "Emma." "Emma. That's a beautiful name." Mark smiled softly, trying to help her feel more comfortable. "Do you have a family?" Emma nodded, her eyes brightening a little. "Yes, my mom and dad." "Where are they, Emma?" Mark asked, his tone serious but gentle. He needed to understand how she had ended up here, alone with the man who had taken her. Emma hesitated, biting her lip. I don't know. He told me we were going to see them, but we never made it. Mark's heart sank. It was clear now that the man wasn't just a stranger. He had been holding Emma against her will, pretending to be someone she could trust. Mark felt a deep anger rise in him. People like this man didn't deserve to walk free. Emma, I want to help you find your mom and dad. Mark's voice softened. Can you remember where you were before you got here? She looked up at him, her expression confused. We were on a highway. I think it was close to a town. I don't really remember. Mark took out his phone and sent a message to his team to check the area. He didn't want to waste any time. He knew that the sooner they could find her parents, the better. He couldn't imagine how worried they must be. While Mark waited for the team to respond, Emma glanced at the patrol car where the man was sitting, still handcuffed. The look in her eyes was a mix of fear and confusion. She didn't fully understand what had happened, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going back with him. You're safe, Emma. I promise you, Mark said gently, his voice reassuring. He could see that she was still processing everything, but there was a small glimmer of hope in her eyes. For the first time, she looked like she might believe it. After a few moments, Mark's radio crackled. Sheriff, we've located her parents. They're on their way. Relief flooded through Mark. He smiled at Emma. We found them, Emma. You're going home soon. Emma's face lit up, and for the first time since he'd met her, she gave him a small smile. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a sign that maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to feel safe again. Sheriff Mark Reynolds stood beside the patrol car, watching the road as he waited for Emma's parents to arrive. The night had gone from tense to hopeful, and now the final step was about to unfold. Emma, standing beside him, seemed to relax just a little more with every passing minute. She had been through so much, but now there was something different in her eyes, a faint spark of hope. The sound of a car engine in the distance caught Mark's attention. His heart picked up its pace. He turned to Emma, who was staring down the road, her fingers tightly gripping the hem of her jacket. Mark could see her nervous excitement building as the headlights grew brighter. He knew how much this moment meant to her. Your mom and dad are on their way, Emma, Mark said, his voice calm and reassuring. He gave her a warm smile, hoping it would help ease some of the tension. Emma nodded but didn't say anything. Her eyes remained fixed on the approaching car. It felt like time had slowed down for Mark as they both waited. He couldn't help but think of his own family and the relief they would feel if one of his children were in trouble and finally returned home. The car came to a stop in front of the patrol car, and the door flew open. A woman rushed out, her face full of worry, followed closely by a man with a look of concern. Mark's heart softened as he saw the look of recognition and love on their faces. They were Emma's parents, relieved and almost desperate to see their daughter again. Emma, her mother cried, her voice shaking with emotion. The moment Emma saw her mother, her face lit up. She ran toward her, her steps quick but unsure, like she still couldn't believe it was really happening. As Emma reached her mother, they embraced, holding each other tightly. Emma's mother kept repeating, "I'm so glad you're safe," over and over, as tears filled her eyes. The father stood back for a moment, his own emotions running high. He wiped a tear from his cheek and watched his daughter being held by her mother. Mark could see the relief written all over their faces. Emma's father turned to Mark, his eyes full of gratitude. Thank you. Thank you so much. We've been looking everywhere for her." His voice was thick with emotion. Mark smiled and nodded. "I'm just glad we could help." He felt a deep sense of pride, knowing he had been part of bringing this family back together. But at the same time, there was a quiet sadness in his heart. He had seen too many cases where families didn't get their loved ones back. This moment, this reunion, was the kind of thing he wished for every child in trouble. After a few moments, Emma pulled away from her mother, wiping her eyes. She looked up at her parents, her face a mix of relief and exhaustion. But there was also something else, a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. "We're going home now, Emma. You're safe, and we're not letting you go again," her father said, pulling her into another tight hug. Emma smiled, finally able to let go of the fear that had gripped her for so long. As Mark stood there, watching the reunion, he felt a warm sense of satisfaction. He had done his job, but more than that, he had helped give this family back what they had lost. For a moment, it seemed like the world had paused, allowing the love between them to fill the space where fear had once been. The job wasn't over yet. There would be follow-up reports and questions for the man in custody. But for now, Mark could rest easy knowing Emma was going home, safe and sound. Sheriff Mark Reynolds watched as Emma and her parents got into their car, ready to head home. The quiet relief in the air was almost tangible. Emma, who had been so full of fear and uncertainty just hours before, was now surrounded by the love and safety of her family. Mark couldn't help but smile as they drove off into the night, knowing he had played a small part in bringing them back together. But even as the car disappeared down the road, the sheriff couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to be done. He couldn't help but think of all the other children out there, children who might be in danger and who didn't have the courage to speak up like Emma had. Her brave gesture, that silent SOS, had saved her life. It was a message that could save many others, if only more people knew what to look for. As Mark turned back toward his patrol car, he thought about how to make sure Emma's story reached as many people as possible. The small signal she had given him, the subtle hand gesture, was something he had learned about years ago in training. But many people didn't know about it. How could they? It wasn't something most people ever thought they would need to know. That's when Mark made a decision. He would work to raise awareness, to teach others about the silent signals that could save lives. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that Emma's story was bigger than just one night. She was one of the lucky ones, but how many other children didn't have the chance to send a silent SOS before it was too late? Over the next few days, Mark spoke to his colleagues and started working on a plan. He reached out to local schools, offering to hold educational seminars for children and parents about safety and awareness. The key message was simple. If you are in danger, there are ways to ask for help without saying a word. He wanted children to know how to signal for help in subtle ways, ways that wouldn't alert a potential abductor. Mark also contacted local news outlets, hoping to share Emma's story with a wider audience. He wanted people to understand how one simple action, a small hand gesture, could make all the difference. Emma had taught him something valuable that night. Sometimes you have to look beyond the surface. In a world where so much was happening all the time, it was easy to overlook the signs of someone in distress. But if you knew what to look for, you could help. The news story about Emma's rescue spread quickly, and soon Mark was receiving messages from all over. Parents, teachers, and even other law enforcement officers reached out to thank him for sharing the story. They were eager to teach their children about the silent SOS, and many schools asked for resources to help spread the word. It was amazing how quickly the message was spreading. Emma's courage had turned into something much bigger, a movement to help keep children safe. As Mark looked at his phone one evening, he received a text from Emma's mother. It was a simple message. "Thank you for everything. Emma is doing well. We'll never forget what you did." Mark smiled and put his phone down. The job was far from over, but it was moments like these that made it all worth it. He had helped one child find her way back home, but now, thanks to Emma, he had the chance to help many more. Sheriff Mark Reynolds sat at his desk the following week, sipping his coffee as he scrolled through the messages and emails that had flooded in after Emma's rescue. The response had been overwhelming. He had expected a few local families to be thankful, but it seemed like the entire community, and even people from other towns, were reaching out to express their gratitude and share their own stories. One email, in particular, stood out. It was from a mother in a neighboring town, telling Mark that her child had learned about the silent SOS gesture from the news and had used it when they felt threatened. The child had safely escaped a dangerous situation, just like Emma had. The mother was beyond thankful, and Mark could feel the weight of the message. It was proof that what he had started was already making a difference. As he sat back in his chair, Mark thought about how much things had changed in such a short time. He never expected one night, one small action, to set off a chain of events that would impact so many lives. It wasn't just about Emma's rescue anymore. It was about something much bigger, a community coming together to protect its children. Mark had been in law enforcement for over 2 decades, but this felt different. The work he did now didn't just happen behind the scenes. It had an impact, and it was a reminder that sometimes the smallest actions could have the biggest consequences. Emma's simple gesture had saved her life, and now it was saving others too. He thought back to that night, the way Emma had looked at him with those pleading eyes, trying to communicate without words. The image of her nervous but hopeful expression stayed with him. Mark knew it would always remind him why he chose this career in the first place: to protect, to help, and to make a difference. Later that day, Mark received a call from Emma's parents. They were calling to thank him again, but this time, the tone was different. Emma was smiling more. She was back in school, and she had started talking more openly about what had happened. It was a relief to hear that she was finding her way back to normalcy after the ordeal. "I'm so proud of her, Mark. You helped her find the strength she needed to get through this." Her mother's voice was full of emotion, and Mark could feel how much they appreciated what had happened. Mark thanked her and promised that he would continue to work hard to make sure that children everywhere knew about the silent SOS. "It's the least I can do," he said, his voice steady but full of meaning. The sheriff knew that he couldn't stop now. There were still so many children who didn't know how to reach out when they were in danger. Emma's story was just the beginning of something much bigger. The more people knew about the silent SOS, the safer the world would be for those who needed help but couldn't speak. As the day came to a close, Mark sat down at his desk, reflecting on everything that had happened. He wasn't just the sheriff of this small town. He had become part of something larger, a movement of awareness and protection for children everywhere. The future looked brighter now. Thanks to Emma's courage and the community's response, more lives would be saved. And for Mark, that was all the reward he needed.